This show is a part of the FM Podcast Network, the home of great music podcasts. Visit us at fmpods.com.
You are listening to the Dilettantes Podcast. Hey everyone, I'm Jim Salvucci of the Dilettantes, and welcome to the latest installment of $1 Million Bash.
It's that $1 Million Bash.
Bob Dylan's 15th, 16th, and 17th studio albums, Planet Waves, Blood on the Tracks, and Desire, had been solid successes when he released Street-Legal in 1978. The album was not universally well received by critics, although it was a commercial success. I remember being told in the early 80s that the album was a disaster, and that I should just avoid it altogether if I wanted to retain any respect for Dylan. Unfortunately, I heeded that advice until after the album was remixed in 1999. My immediate reaction upon listening to it then was to try to recall who gave me that atrocious advice way back when. I wanted vengeance. That person denied me 20 years of listening to Street-Legal, although I suppose I bear a smidgen of responsibility. The band was mostly drawn from the large ensemble performing during Dylan's Japanese and Australian tours, and notably included a chorus consisting of Dylan's future wife, Carolyn Dennis, veteran singer Joanne Harris, and Helena Spriggs, who was all of 17 at the time. He would continue to record and tour with the chorus through much of the 80s. The recording sessions were reportedly sloppy, being held in Dylan's rehearsal space called Rundown Studios using mobile equipment on a truck. The resulting sonics from the original mix were less than stellar, which may be why the album had a rough reputation. The saxophone bits sound somewhat dated now, but they still work. Street-Legal is a transitional album in many ways, standing between the mid-70s classics and the gospel years to come. The song lyrics depict a troubled soul. The album opens with the percussion-driven, tarot-inflected changing of the guards and culminates with Where Are You Tonight? Journey Through Dark Heat, which references a battle against the enemy within. With such numbers as the surreal and apocalyptic Seigneur, Tales of Yankee Power, the hard-rocking blues of the allegorical and arguably misogynistic screed New Pony, and the pathos-inducing plaint Is Your Love in Vain, we experience a Dylan who is searching for some meaning in his life. Perhaps it is not then surprising that Dylan's Christian conversion happened sometime around the recording of the album. The album's current reputation is wide-ranging. While it remains a controversial low point for some, others advocate for a Street-Legal installment of the Bootleg series. I personally find the album magisterial and frustrating, and brilliant and heartbreaking, and baffling and inspiring. One of my faves. Today we are joined by three of our regular bashers. Unfortunately, Nina Goss and Court Carney were not able to join us this month, but we will get this powerhouse roundtable back together for sure, don't you worry. So let's introduce today's panel. First up, we've got Graley Herren. Hey, Graley.
Hello to you all. Glad to be here again.
Next up, Rockin Rob Reginio.
Hey, everyone. Glad to be here. Jim, thanks very much for having us.
And we round out our mini panel with Erin Callahan, who will be launching her own podcast soon, Infinity Goes Up on Trial. Hey, Erin.
Hey, how is everyone today? A very solemn Good Friday to you all.
Well, it won't be Good Friday to anyone listening to this, but
it is for us today. Yeah,
it is for us
I'm
today.
glad to be here.
And Erin, do you want to tell us a little bit about your new podcast?
Sure. So Infinity Goes Up on Trial will launch on my own Substack by the same name, Infinity Goes Up on Trial, and through the FM Podcast Network. And my focus is looking at people who are both in the Dylan world, but also Dylan adjacent, to look at how the ideas in Dylan's work really are universal, and we're looking at them through a deeper kind of political, social, cultural, and artistic context. And my first guest is a theater director and playwright, Jason Nodler, who explores how the feeling in Dylan's work influenced his art and his life. My second guest will be a theologian, so stay tuned for May 1st. Every month we'll drop an episode, and hopefully I'll see all of you good folks on it too.
All right. I hope your theologian solves our age-old dilemma as to whether Christmas in the Heart is one of the Christian albums.
Maybe. I can ask him. He isn't one of our Dylan adjacents, though, so he may not have a suitable answer for that.
All right. Looking forward to that. And
Thanks, Jim.
congratulations.
Thank you.
So to get us started, I'm going to launch us into this by offering a little tidbit that Court left with me. He said, I think a key part of street legal is the narrative of rediscovery. It would be interesting to talk about how it was originally received and how or why it became resuscitated in the early aughts. It became a symbol of generational shifts, I think. So in other words, what he's talking about here is the reception of street legal, both by fans and by critics. And I gave you a little of that in my introduction. So if we could start talking with that, we can go from there.
I think Court and I have had, I'll just start and then we can riff off each other. But I think Court and I have had a lot of discussions about how we come to Dylan. And again, if you are one of the original fans and you're going through it chronologically, maybe street legal is a disappointment. But if you are coming into it at any entry point, you're looking at some of the themes in street legal of transition, of like trying to find yourself. And so I think maybe that's why, because we see Dylan struggling in this album, and not really maybe artistically, but more so personally, because 1977, his divorce is final, and this is recorded right after he gets back from the Japan-Australia tour, very quickly, as you said, very messily. And so I think even the cover image to me represents Dylan descending from something, and he's still looking. He's come down from something, and so there's a descent, and he's searching for whether it's a guide or direction or something. And I think a lot of folks, particularly in the aughts, if we're looking at America, all the turmoil that's going on, maybe people were they were in that same period of searching. So perhaps that is why there's a rediscovery of it. I'm open to being wrong about that, but that's what I think.
I have to say that the album cover and the album title are two of the strangest combinations. It's street legal. If you look up the definition of street legal, it is not a remarkable thing. It is dullness itself. And the picture itself it's just very strange with him looking up the street. But it is, and I wonder if that even put people off, but could be. But I like that idea of the aughts being a time of searching as well. Rob, you were going to say something?
I was just going to say that one of the things that struck, it's like your experience with the album. It's not an album that I turn back to often. So I was really happy to be able to turn back to it and think about it in this way. And the changing of the guards and Senor, for example, especially Senor, Erin's talking about the resonances of that. I think it's a really brilliant argument about the reception of the album in the early aughts, where we Americans searching, and therefore the narrator that is seen throughout these songs searching, sometimes in an agonized way, resonates. And I found a lot of these songs resonating certainly with Dylan's own biography, which I'll talk about more later. But Senor, I guess I'm picking that one up, is definitely thinking it's got political resonances in it, right? You had the 73 coup by Pinochet, and I can talk a little bit later about the opening verse of that. And so it goes beyond a lot of, I don't really know the kind of reception of it, and I can't articulate that as well as Erin could, but certainly the way in which it's written about, it's definitely the shadow of his conversion lies heavily over this album. And so it was really great to get that shadow of the conversion out. And a lot of the writing does see it as this transitional album where its greatness and magnificence and frustrations, to borrow Jim's language, come from the fact that we're reading it as, it's in a determinate way, that it's leading him to evangelical Christianity. That's where this album is going to sift itself out. But I don't know, but taking it on its own, it's a really interesting album in that he could have gone in many different directions. He didn't necessarily have to convert to evangelical Christianity. I think without the Christian conversion trilogy of albums that follow it, if we look at it just on its own, it's a really interesting album in that regard.
I think so too. To answer you, Rob, I did a little bit of research on how often he's played these songs live, and only 2 of them have been played outside of the 78 tour. And Senor Tales of Yankee Power has been played 265 times, which is a lot. He hasn't played it in 13 years, but clearly that song in particular is one that he returns to. And I think because there is that theme, maybe I don't know if it's overtly political, but there's something there that he keeps going back to play live that he really likes. Like my argument with Silvio, he's played it so much because he likes to play it. But I think there's something maybe a little bit deeper in this song, because there is that person who is in Mexico. There's that sense of border and sort of that to bring up Anselmo's Borderlands, like he's in a sort of meta phase and he's searching for someone to guide him. And you're right. If we take it on its own, it doesn't necessarily presage the gospel period, but it could be any searching for any guide. And so I think there's something there that it does translate outside of just that moment in time in Dylan's career.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the opening verse, do you know where we're headed, Licking County Road or Armageddon? It reminds me so much of the opening verse of Blind Willie McTell, right? There's an arrow on the doorpost, right? To New Orleans, to Jerusalem. So it's remarkably similar in that regard. And of course, Blind Willie McTell is something that he recovers during the Never Ending Tour and plays many times. So it's interesting that he's going back to those songs.
I'd love to hear from Graley here. Do you have anything to say about the reception of the album?
I hope you're able to hear me. I apparently am getting bad connection here. It kicked me out of Zoom for a minute. And so hopefully I don't come in and out for you. Yeah, I think the evangelical association of this album is indispensable with my experience of it. I was not around as a Dylan fan in 1978. I was alive, but I wasn't listening to Bob Dylan yet. And so in retrospect, coming myself, to be honest about it, from a fairly fundamentalist Bible thumping background in the hills of Tennessee, a part of Dylan's career that for years I just bracketed as not interested was the evangelical stuff, right? That was not what I came to Dylan for, and I just didn't immerse myself in it. In retrospect, I think foolishly, I think said some of his greatest performances, but the material just was not attractive to me. And I think that I caught up in the wake of that. And so in the early 2000s, and especially with the release of the Trouble No More bootleg series, I really started appreciating that whole body of work and that period of Dylan's work more. And now I do find lyrically an astounding album, Street-Legal. But I think my first entryway back into it was the sound. It's this big sound. It's not a sound that I had heard from Dylan since I had not listened to the evangelical stuff. And it just sounds really cool. People complain about the sound being the strike against it, right? The sonnets of it. My ears are not sophisticated enough to hear what it is I'm supposed to hate about this album sonically. And I don't hear that. Instead, I just think, wow, it's cool to hear so many different vocalists and a saxophone and these sounds that Dylan is experimenting with at that time. Now, to me, just sounds really cool.
I love Billy Cross's electric guitar, his lead guitar on New Pony and We Better Talk This Over. That's really great stuff, really spectacular. I agree with you in that regard.
So let's talk a little bit more about the sound. And I wish I could say that, Graley, that you had a tight connection to our Zoom, but you keep fading in and out there. But you got your message across, I think, enough. But let's talk a little bit about that big sound, the guitars, the bongos, the saxophone. This is pretty unique in terms of an ensemble for Dylan. I know he was touring with a similar band, but we don't really hear this much in his studio releases. What do you make of that?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of the initial reaction to Street-Legal's sound was, here he is trying to catch up to Springsteen. Here he is trying to grab some of that full-blooded, massive, all pistons running rock and roll album. But I don't know if that explanation works for me, because he's always sonically exploring. He's always exploring sonically. He's always throwing new instrumentation in there. And something like Desire and the Rolling Thunder Review Tour certainly doesn't have the full panoply of different instruments, like you mentioned, the bongos and the saxophone and so on and so forth. But Desire is an explore of different sounds and different ways of singing as much as this album is, I think. So I don't find it uniquely like standing out. Certainly he doesn't deploy or use saxophones and in the studio in other albums, but the saxophones are like Scarlett Rivera's violin in Desire. He's exploring sonically. So it doesn't really, for me, it's not, oh, this is this kind of, he's trying to do a Springsteen. He's trying to make himself relevant in some way. I don't think that's true.
I agree with you, Rob, because I don't see Dylan saying, oh, that guy's doing that. I'm going to do it to be relevant. And so it's the same kind of sound that he has in Budokan. And so I just think this is what he's trying at this point because he has the bongos and the saxophone and all of those things. And I think it may be lazy to say, oh, there's a saxophone that Dylan's using now, so he's trying to sound like Springsteen because Springsteen has Clarence Clemons. But I do find it interesting that this is the first album where he doesn't play harmonica. And I wonder, did you guys miss the harmonica? This is the first time we don't hear him playing it. And Graley shaking his head no, because you've talked previously, Graley, about how you like the harmonica almost as Dylan's second voice. That was one of my questions. So I was like, oh, yeah, he doesn't play harmonica on this. And I wonder what you guys think of that, because that's a definite shift for thinking about this new music and how it's sonically different. The absence of what's notably part of his voice is missing from this.
That's funny because I love Springsteen and had never thought of it as Dylan doing his Springsteen, though now I really want to think about that some more because this would be the same year as The River and Clarence Clemons, a very notable sax player as part of that rock outfit. I guess at the time, I was not around at the time, but it was compared much more to Dylan going Vegas, like doing the Elvis impersonation. And he even had on that tour Elvis's bass player, since Elvis had died the year before, or Dylan going Neil Diamond. And I can see that as well, especially since Robbie Robertson was producing some of Neil Diamond's work around this same time. Yeah, I can see those comparisons. I could see those comparisons more at the time. In retrospect, though, like you're saying, it's hard for me to believe that Dylan is simply being derivative. And he never seems to make to the extent that he makes career calculations at all, it seems to never be what will make me most popular, what will sell the most albums and tickets. If anything, he seems to be doing the opposite of that calculated move.
One thing that's true with Dylan is that most of his music, particularly up to this point, had been sonically either leading edge or completely off the rails, right? Everybody else is going psychedelic, and he releases John Wesley Harding in Nashville Skyline, or the wild Mercury sound of Blonde on Blonde, very cutting edge. And you could even see that with Desire. Not what everybody else is doing. Other people follow it. In some ways, one could argue that this album, Street-Legal, and even subsequent albums were more trailing edge, right? Or at least in with the pack for some time. And that might even explain some of the bad press that the 80s get altogether. You certainly see that with some of the production values, like Tight Connection. It was on my brain. Empire Burlesque very much has an 80s production sound to it. This album sounds very late 70s, unlike any other Dylan album with the saxophones and whatnot. Those are musical tropes of the late 70s. What other thoughts you have about the sound, though? Do you think it, aside from just the reception, what's your opinion about the sound? I mean, do you like it?
Sometimes I do. I think it was Rob that said earlier, this is not an album I have listened to a lot over the years. There are the big three, which I think Changing of the Guards, Senor, and Where Are You Tonight? Those are huge, massive, major Bob Dylan works. I would put Where Are You Tonight as, if I were to do, I'm not into rankings, but it would be in my top 10 Bob Dylan songs of all time. I just think it's an amazing song. The others I find more interesting, but by Dylan standards, more forgettable. And partially it's the sound, maybe partially it's lyrics, but they're minor works to me, musically and lyrically, compared to the big three.
But even that, Graley, it's a third of his album, which are masterpieces. And even the minor works are better than what most folks do. And I agree with you about those three. And I have a special place in my heart for Is Your Love in Vain? I know it's not a great song, but I do love that song. And I like the live version at Budokan where he previewed. I don't know. Like, I'm with Graley, like sometimes. And I think with Dylan, it's like, it depends on my mood or what I'm interested in listening to. But a street legal one that I'm like, oh, I have to listen to it. Like when we were talking about Love and Theft, I love and Theft, and I'll go back to that often. Or there are some albums that you just play. This isn't one that I'm like, I have to listen to street legal. Maybe 3 to 4 songs from it. Yes, they'll be in a rotation, but no, not. I'm just like, yes, I'm in a street legal mood. Let's put it on and jam. No.
Thank you for listening to the Dilettantes Podcast. Be sure to subscribe to FM Pods to hear the complete podcast.